So I've been getting some questions about single sign-on and what it is and how we get it, not only in Azure, but once you start talking about that, the question becomes, well, how did we get it before in Active Directory? So we're going to go through maybe a couple of videos and we'll talk a little bit about single sign-on. So what is single sign-on? Well, what is it not? Well, first of all, what is not single sign-on is having to type in your username and your password every time you go to a different service. Now, this used to be the way it was back in the day with computers, because every single computer had their own little account database, and you needed to have a username and a password on that computer when you connected to it. Interestingly enough, this is still with us if you choose it to be with you in the form of Microsoft Windows work groups. A work group isn't really any affiliation at all. A work group is just a bunch of independent computers. If you're in a work group, you're not in anything. All the computers in a work group are independent. They all have their individual user account databases, and every one of them has users and passwords. And if I'm sitting at computer A and I need to go to computer B or server C, I need to know a username and a password over there or over there. So it's very difficult to work with. We have passwords all over the place. If we change our password in one place, it's not changed in the other places. So we'd have to manually go over and change it. We see this on the internet a lot too, right? When you go to a website for the first time, you're trying to sign up, you have to sign up with a username and a password. And once again, we're stuck with remembering umpteen usernames and umpteen passwords, and all the passwords are different. So we start using the same password. And if one website gets broken into, now our password is exposed for all the websites. So it's an imperfect world to do things that way. Well, let's talk about a little history of on-premise and how we got rid of doing things that way, how we got single sign-on, and then we'll talk a little bit about single sign-on in the cloud. So on-premise with Microsoft accounts and with Windows, we have the concept of a domain. And what a domain is something that your computer joins. There are machines called domain controllers that have user account databases, and you put a bunch of stuff in there. These are Active Directory databases. They hold users, computers, groups, but for our purposes right now, let's focus on user accounts. So Active Directory runs on domain controllers, and that's where users and user accounts and their passwords get stored. When computers join a domain, it basically tells all those computers that used to be in a work group that now, in addition to their own individual databases where users are, they now can use user accounts from the domain database. And this is what effectively gets us into single sign-on. Now, in a domain, we have a couple of different types of authentication we can use. There's an older authentication called NTLM. It was a password-based authentication. It's still around, but it got a single sign-on. We authenticated to the domain controller, and then every time we went somewhere else, we had to prove our password over and over again. Well, we actually kept a little hash of the password right on our PC when we logged on, so we could easily do that. But NTLM is an older protocol. It's not very secure, and we try and get rid of it. It's also real chatty. Our new protocol that's been around, I say new, but it's been around for 20 years at this point, is Kerberos. And the way Kerberos works is when we log on in the morning, yes, we have to provide our username and our password usually. We'll talk about passwordless authentication later on. Let's just stick with usernames and passwords. We supply our username and password. Kerberos runs also on domain controllers. It's another service, and it checks to see if we know our username and password. If we do, then the Kerberos service sends us something called a ticket. In this case, it's called a ticket granting ticket. It's like a master thing that lets us get to other machines on the network. Once we have this ticket granting ticket, when we want to go to a server somewhere else that also belongs to the domain, we'll type in, let's say we're going to a file server, we type in // file server 1. we actually don't go to file server 1 right away. We actually go right back to a domain controller, to the Kerberos service, and we present our ticket granting ticket. And then the Kerberos service on the domain controller, they send us back something called a service ticket, which then we present to our file server, and that lets us in. Why would it do that? Well, it's all based on trust, and the trusts are actually implemented using a kind of cryptography, asymmetric public-private key cryptography. Suffice to say that the tickets that we use are trusted all around the domain. So we have our one ticket that we get when we sign on in the morning, and then we get individual tickets for all the other servers using that one ticket. By the way, that Kerberos ticket, by default, it lasts 10 hours, the usual workday. So tomorrow, when we sign in, we get a new Kerberos ticket. So this requires that our computers actually join that domain. That's what sets up the initial trust between our machine and the domain controller and allows us to use accounts on the domain controller. All right, well, what about the cloud? What about Office 365 and Azure Active Directory up in the cloud? Well, a similar process can take place in the cloud. So now with Windows 10 and to a degree Windows 8 and Windows 7, but hopefully we're all past using Windows 8 and getting rid of Windows 7 and moving to Windows 10. With these clients can actually join Azure Active Directory. It's not the same as joining on-premise Active Directory. On-premise, when we join, we use this Kerberos authentication. In the cloud, though, Kerberos doesn't work. It just doesn't. There's port numbers that can't be used. There's all sorts of different authentication, web-based authentication. Just impractical to use Kerberos in the cloud. So we have to use other protocols in the cloud. These other protocols are called OAuth, OpenID Connect, SAML. There's a few different kinds that have come up over the years. When we join a computer to Azure Active Directory, normally we're using OpenID Connect and OAuth 2, but we'll leave those terms aside and we'll talk about what happens when we actually join a computer to the cloud. So actually there's a few ways to join a computer to Azure. You can just do a straight Azure join, which means the computer is only joined to Azure. You can also do something called a device registration. This is usually done when people own their own devices, and then they can go into the settings and the Windows 10 settings, and they can go into that little work or school account and add their Azure account from there. That registers the device. What's the difference? You know what? There's not a big, huge difference functionally. A user would not notice a difference as to whether their computer was actually joined to Azure or merely registered with Azure. Underneath the curtains, things happen a little bit differently, but the bottom line is the user experience is going to be pretty much exactly the same. What happens when we join Azure, or join a computer to Azure, or we register a computer with Azure, is just like when we're logging on to our on-premise, we get one of those Kerberos tickets. In the cloud, what we get is called a token. In the case of the first time that we authenticate to the cloud, when we boot our computer up, we type our username and password, we get something called a primary refresh token. It's kind of like the Kerberos ticket granting ticket. It's the token that we use to get other tokens. So we get this primary refresh token sent down to our computer. And then from then on, if we go to a service like our Exchange mailbox in the cloud, we get another token to pass to it. You can call this a session token, a service token. They're called by a couple of different names, but it works in the same principle as this Kerberos, the Kerberos tickets, only in the cloud, we call these tokens. So in the cloud, single sign-on happens much the same as it happens on-premise from the user's point of view. They boot up their computer, they type in their username, their cloud username, which is probably their on-premise username, right? They're going to type in their cloud username and their password, and an authentication thing happens to the Azure authentication server, and they get sent down that primary refresh token. Then when they go to any other service in the cloud, in Office 365, be it SharePoint or Teams, or to-do or their mailbox, they actually get another token to present to that service. So we can either be joined on-premise to Active Directory or joined in the cloud to Azure Active Directory, right? Well, not quite. You see, there's a third option that we have. It's a great option for those companies who have on-premise Active Directory and Office 365, meaning they have Azure Active Directory. We have a combined option. We can do something called a hybrid join, which means that we're joined to our Active Directory on-premise, and then we are also joined to Azure Active Directory. Now this requires a little bit of setup, and the AD Connect tool helps us set this up. But what happens is we're joined to our local Active Directory, and with some group policy settings, some registry settings, another option for doing it, we can automatically join Azure Active Directory. And what this means is that when we log on in the morning, we're logging on to our on-premise Active Directory, and we're also logging on to Azure Active Directory. So we get our ticket granting ticket from our local Active Directory, and we get our Azure primary refresh token from Azure. So when we go to an on-premise file server, let's say, we're using our Kerberos ticket granting ticket to get a service ticket to go to that file server. If we go to, let's say, SharePoint in the cloud, we're using our primary refresh token to get a token to go to the SharePoint server. So Windows 10 is smart enough to figure this out if we go to a cloud resource or an on-premise resource. So that's the basics of joining a machine, a Windows 10, or again, you can join down-level clients both on-premise in the cloud as well, Windows 7 and Windows 8, 8.1. But for the most part, most companies are getting rid of those for now or hopefully in the near future. So that's the basics of actually getting those machines joined into one, the other, or both. Now there are instances when you actually want to use Azure, but the device is not joined or can't be joined, or you don't want it joined. We'll talk about that next, and Microsoft does have a solution for that. It's called seamless single sign-on. It's actually something different than the regular single sign-on you get when your device is joined to Azure Active Directory. Seamless single sign-on is kind of a trick. We'll talk about that in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe down at the bottom if you haven't already.